Thank you, Vince. And now we will call on Mitten, who will give us some insights from the legal perspective.
Well, thanks, Professor Dunn. I'm a proud Ohio State graduate. I'm really glad to see that the Sports and Society Initiative has come out of not only the College of Arts and Sciences, but Department of Economics. I was an economics major, and I sure wish we didn't have sports economics back in those days. Would have loved to have taken it, so it's a pleasure to be back here. Well, our topic is paying college athletes, and in my mind, the question is really who should decide if they're going to get paid, and if so, how much? As Vince mentioned, there is certainly unfairness in the present system. So I'll have a proposal, but bear with me while I kind of go through this once. There's basically been traditionally two different models of U.S. domestic sports competition. One, the NCAA is based off of, it's called the amateur education model, which is traditionally described high school and college sports, where those playing the sports are student athletes. We're unique in the United States because of the close connection between athletics and educational systems at these levels, where students play sports for the love of the game and because of the life lessons. That's why high schools and colleges have traditionally offered it. And it's interesting, at both levels, high school and college, it was the students themselves that started playing sports. Then you had faculty and administrators saying, well, perhaps we should regulate it. Schools started playing schools, and then regulatory bodies developed. And the NCAA, I think it's very important to talk about, well, who is the NCAA? The NCAA is its member schools, more than 1,000 that play at 3 different divisions. They make the rules. And what the NCAA has, what they do, it's really 2 different roles. One is a vast self-regulation. You have this massive entity in Indianapolis with a whole host of people involved. So there's rules, enforcement, all of that. And they also put on championships in every sport except Division I FBS football. That is not something that the NCAA conducts. And the bulk of the revenues that come in are from the broadcast rights to the men's basketball tournament. So the NCAA rules say, well, these are amateurs. Intercollegiate athletics, integral part of the educational program, and want to maintain this clear demarcation between intercollegiate and professional sports. The other model is the professional model, which I would call a commercial professional model, for-profit entities, part of the broader entertainment system, paid professional athletes. The 2 laws that have historically regulated that have been antitrust, which would promote a free market, but if the players would choose to unionize, they have, because for the majority of them, they're better off. And then we have collectively bargained terms and conditions of employment. Now, what has happened is that this traditional amateur education model has morphed into a commercial education model for the college sports of football and men's basketball. Why is that? It's really because of how popular they are. They are, for the most part, the only 2 sports that consistently generate more revenues than costs. And what we're seeing is various efforts to try to professionalize college sports. But I think there's some important things to keep in mind, 2 important differences, at least, between college and professional sports. There's not any cash payments made to college athletes, unlike professional athletes, although there is now the stipends to an extent. There is no profit distribution. You don't have that. And the other thing that's unique about college sports is there's very much a cross-subsidization of most of the women's sports and the men's non-revenue sports. So those are some key differences to keep in mind here. So let's briefly go through, well, why aren't or are college athletes employees? Because there's no question they are one of the 2 primary inputs necessary to provide college sports, along with the coaches, who are, of course, incredibly well paid. It's very much a free market system of competition. So from a historical perspective, the judicial system has said, well, athletic scholarships are contracts. No question, there's various quid pro quos. You get an opportunity to get an education, and courts, for the most part, have said we're only going to enforce express promises between the university and its student athletes, and of course, NCAA and conference rules get incorporated into that. The first efforts to characterize college athletes as employees was when student athletes would suffer serious injuries while playing a sport and would attempt to recover workers' compensation benefits. And courts have pretty much uniformly said, well, they are not employees. Why not? Because this is not a contract for hire. And courts looked at it and they were focusing on, well, what did the parties really intend? It was that, well, they were full-time students. NCAA rules get incorporated. They are, quote, amateurs. There was some effort to make, but they looked at the conduct and, you know, maybe the economic realities are, given the extensive degree of control that is exercised over student athletes, it's not only when they're playing and practicing, but it's like you take your courses at certain times, what courses you take, all of that. You could make an argument that, well, it's looking a little bit more like a traditional employment relationship than just the traditional student relationship. But nonetheless, courts were saying, no, not for workers' comp purposes. And then there was a very important antitrust case brought against the NCAA in 1984, challenging the exclusive college football television plan. And although it had nothing to do with whether college sports and athletes are amateur in nature, the Supreme Court said, quote, college athletes must not be paid. And what happened is the various challenges that were brought to NCAA eligibility rules, courts picked up on that, and basically it was per se illegal, any kind of eligibility rule out there, whether it's academic rules, rules that says you can't be paid more than the value of a full scholarship. And as one court said, the NCAA does not exist as a minor league training ground for future NFL players, but rather to provide an opportunity for competition among amateur students pursuing a collegiate education. So regardless of the realities, that was the view courts were taking. So let's shift now to what has happened. What have been these legal efforts, efforts to use the legal system to establish a commercial professional model for college sports, at least football and men's basketball. The antitrust cases came first, but I'm going to talk about the efforts by Northwestern football players to unionize. And I kept up with that very much because even though I teach at Marquette in Milwaukee, I live in downtown Chicago, so extensive coverage there. And it was interesting that that was chosen as the place, to unionize. I mean, Northwestern, very high graduation rate, relatively few of their football players go on and play in the NFL. But it was a good example of forum shopping. Council knew that if you were going to find a regional director likely to characterize college football players as employees, it was going to be in Chicago. And that's in fact what happened. In a very detailed opinion, the Chicago regional director said, well, college athletes look a lot, they're basically employees. If you look at the degree of control, scholarship is compensation, all of that taken together. So essentially applying much the same factors that courts did in determining that college athletes were not employees, reached the exact opposite conclusion. However, to a lot of people's surprise, including mine, the 5-member National Labor Relations Board in Washington, so Northwestern appealed that, and the NLRB basically said, well, maybe they are employees, but we're not going to exercise jurisdiction. The NLRB has that discretion, and they looked at it and they said, well, Northwestern is the only private school in the Big Ten of the 14 schools, and I think there's only maybe 20 private schools among the 130 or so Division I FBS schools. And under federal labor law, it is only employees at private schools or private industry. The National Labor Relations Act only regulates private employment relationships. So you could not, for example, if you're a public school football player, like at Ohio State, you could only unionize if state law permitted it. And Ohio moved very, very quickly to pass a law that said no college athlete in Ohio could do it. So you can't have a system like in the NFL or the NBA or Major League Baseball where all the athletes can unionize and collectively bargain. Not possible under current law. Another interesting case along this line was an effort by University of Pennsylvania track and field athletes to collect workers' compensation, or not workers' compensation. They were trying to get minimum wage. They made the claim unsuccessfully that they were employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this is an interesting one because Penn is part of the Ivy League where athletic scholarships, they have agreed not to provide them. And there the court, relying on much the same reasoning of courts finding that there was athletes are not employees for workers' comp benefits, said, no, you're not entitled to minimum wage. Which brings us to the OBannon case, which has been going on for a number of years, will likely reach the U.S. Supreme Court. In the interest of time, I won't go through the district court's decision, but it goes up on appeal. And here's what the current law is. Now, one of the most significant things is that this was the first federal appellate court that said that NCAA eligibility rules are a commercial restraint that can be challenged under federal antitrust law. Almost all the other ones said, no, those are a form of non-commercial internal regulation, not subject to antitrust challenge, presumed to be legal. So that was a significant victory for the plaintiffs and the student athletes in that case. The Ninth Circuit affirmed the lower court's decision, which says that there are some pro-competitive justifications for these rules, which is a form of price fixing, no question, when the NCAA schools get together and cap the amount of compensation that any student athlete can get. The real question is, well, are there any countervailing pro-competitive justifications? Because the rule is we balance the positives and the negatives. And two of them were basically found, that the limits on compensation integrate academics with athletics and preserve the popularity of college sports by promoting amateurism. And the key part of the Ninth Circuit's decision is they said that providing the full cost of attendance, that would be a substantially less restrictive means of achieving those objectives. So for example, maintaining the amateur nature of college sports can still exist, but you bump up that amount, whereas there had been that 1,500, 2,500 or so disparity in the past. However, the court then went on to say, you can't pay student athletes more than that. As the district court had said, well, an amount up to $5,000 per student athlete per year they play, I don't think that that would be something that would change the fundamental brand of college sports, which is fairly extraordinary for a judge. I mean, judges are not regulators, and for a federal judge to say, well, I find unreasonable price fixing, the solution is what I think is reasonable price fixing. So not surprising to those who are knowledgeable about antitrust law that that would be reversed. And the Ninth Circuit said, well, what not paying student athletes is precisely what makes them amateurs, and made it pretty clear that any cash stipends offered had to be tethered to educational expenses. So that's where we're at this point. The case is on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it's fairly likely the Supreme Court will hear it because of its importance. Then there's a couple other cases going on that are trying to use antitrust law to take even more drastic steps, which we'll maybe talk about in discussion. So I've only got a couple more minutes, so I'll go through this really quickly. My view is that professionalization of college sports is not the answer to the current problems caused by commercialized college sports. What are those problems? I think there's really at least three important things. One, there's a misallocation of resources from academics to athletics. Universities, at most schools, or at most universities, they put more into their athletic program than they get out of it in economic terms. So there are resources going from the academic side, or could be used for the academic side, over to the athletic side. Why do they do it? Well, it's a rational investment. You know, sports is, particularly winning high-profile teams, it's the front porch of the university. It is not an irrational decision to make. But two of the more significant problems that also arise is the marginalization of the educational aspects of college sports, particularly for athletes of color playing big-time sports. The lowest graduation rates are for men's football and of course, football and men's basketball. That's a problem if the athletes who play those sports are, giving their playing services and not getting the benefit of the bargain, which is the degree. The other thing is economic exploitation of elite Division I football and men's basketball players. Quite honestly, there's probably only a handful of athletes whose fair market value exceeds the marginal revenue product of what the value of their athletic scholarship is. So the real question here is, how do we solve the problems but preserve the social benefits of the commercial education model of college sports? What does it do beneficially? Provides access to college educational opportunities for the athletically gifted. It's a popular, distinctive brand of entertainment. This cross-subsidization of sports, which is rampant in universities. I know as a law professor, for years, law schools have cross-subsidized many other departments of the university. It happens. I mean, there is a shifting of resources. That, I think, is a very good thing because it increases output. We have more opportunities for for female athletes, for male non-revenue sports. And I think that the social and public policy benefits in the long term are going to be much better coming up with something other than professionalizing college sports. What's not going to work? So I'll just go through this real quickly here. Certainly, you can't have unionization of college sports. Even if antitrust law, were applied, antitrust law is prohibitory in nature. It says these are unreasonable restraints. It doesn't say what you have to do. So antitrust is not a good regulatory model. If you apply it to pro sports, professional athletes have chosen to unionize because collectively they can be better off by unionizing. Economically self-interested NCAA internal reform doesn't work. It's just asking too much of of the universities to do this. So I will talk about later during the thing it's a proposed federal regulatory model where it's open and transparent. Everyone will have a full and equal voice, and then there'll be antitrust immunity if their reforms would be voluntarily adopted. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt.